I used to believe stability was the same as happiness. That if a life looked settled from the outside, it must feel whole on the inside. For nearly 4 years, I lived inside that belief with Mark, in a small apartment that always smelled faintly of coffee and detergent, where every object had its place, and so did we. Mark was dependable in the ways people admire. He remembered bills, planned weekends, asked how my day went. He held my hand in public without hesitation. Yet somewhere between routine dinners and quiet nights, our conversations had thinned. We spoke about schedules, not dreams. About groceries, not fears. I told myself this was what long-term love matured into. Comfort. Predictability. Silence that didn't need explaining. Still, some evenings, when Mark fell asleep before me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling an unnamed ache press against my chest. It wasn't anger or resentment. It was absence. I missed being seen without having to speak. I missed the version of myself that once felt vivid that I never voiced this to Mark. How do you complain about emptiness when nothing is technically wrong? The night everything shifted began like any other. A sudden rainstorm caught me walking home alone, my jacket useless against the cold drizzle. I ducked into a small cafe near the subway, more to escape the rain than for coffee. The place was narrow and dim, filled with the low murmur of conversations and the soft clink of cups. That's where I noticed Ethan. That he stood near the counter, shaking rain from his hair, laughing quietly at something the barista said. It wasn't loud laughter. It was contained, effortless. Something about it pulled my attention before I could stop myself. When he turned, our eyes met for a brief second, long enough for recognition, short enough to remain safe that I looked away first. There was no dramatic moment, no lightning strike. Just a subtle awareness, like a door inside me had been nudged open. When I ordered my coffee, Ethan stood beside me, close enough that I could sense his presence without looking. He commented on the weather, an ordinary remark, yet it landed with unexpected warmth. That we talked while waiting. About the storm. About how the city felt different when it rained. His voice was calm, thoughtful, unhurried. He didn't ask invasive questions. He listened. When he smiled, it wasn't performative, it was honest, almost restrained. That I told myself this was nothing. Just a conversation between strangers. But when our drinks arrived and we parted ways, something lingered. As I stepped back into the rain, I realized my chest felt lighter, as if I had inhaled deeply for the first time in months. At home, Mark was already there, scrolling through his phone on the couch. He looked up and smiled, the same familiar smile I had known for years. I kissed his cheek, hung my jacket, and told him about the rain. I didn't mention the cafe. I didn't mention Ethan. There was no reason to, yet that night, as Mark slept beside me, my mind returned to a stranger's voice and a laugh I barely knew. The thought unsettled me. I had done nothing wrong. Still, guilt brushed against me like a warning. Over the next few days, I caught myself replaying the encounter in fragments. The way Ethan held eye contact without intensity. The ease of the conversation. I told myself it was simply novelty, the brain's response to something new. I was committed. I was loyal. I was just tired. Then, a week later, I saw him again. This time, it was deliberate only on fate's part. The same cafe. The same hour. Ethan noticed me first and smiled with recognition, not surprise. We sat together without discussing how unlikely the coincidence was. Conversation flowed more naturally than it should have. He spoke about his work, his recent move to the city, his uncertainty about what came next. Without meaning to, I spoke more honestly than I had in months. When I checked my phone, I realized how much time had passed. A message from Mark waited unanswered. The sight of it grounded me, and the guilt returned, sharper now. As we stood to leave, Ethan hesitated, then offered his number, not confidently, not nervously, but openly. In case we run into another storm, he said. That I took it. Walking home, the rain had stopped, but the weight inside me had grown heavier. I knew, with unsettling clarity, that something had begun. Not an affair. Not a betrayal. But a question, one I had avoided asking myself for years, and once asked, I wasn't sure I could ignore it again. I told myself I would not use Ethan's number. I even deleted it once, then recovered it from memory as if my mind had been waiting for permission. When I finally sent a message, it was casual, harmless, a comment about the weather turning colder. His reply came quickly, warm without being demanding. That balance alone made my chest tighten. Our conversations grew in small, careful steps. We talked at night, when Mark was already asleep, his steady breathing a reminder of the life I was still living. Ethan never asked about my relationship directly, yet he never pretended it didn't exist either. I volunteered details on my own, framing them carefully, as though the right words could absolve me. With Ethan, I felt articulate again. I spoke about fears I hadn't named, about the quiet anxiety of becoming invisible inside a life that looked complete. He listened the way people do when they aren't waiting for their turn to speak. In his responses, there was no urgency, only understanding. That frightened me more than flirtation ever could. Mark noticed the change before I did. He asked why I seemed distant, why my laughter arrived late, why I carried my phone everywhere. I assured him nothing was wrong, and he accepted it because trust had always been our strongest habit. Each reassurance felt like a borrowed truth. When Ethan and I met again, it was planned. A walk through a public park in the late afternoon, chosen deliberately for its innocence. We kept a polite distance between us, yet the air felt charged with things unsaid. He told me about a past relationship that ended not with anger but exhaustion. I recognized myself in his words more than I wanted to admit that I never touched him. That became my private defense. I drew the line there, convinced that physical restraint equaled moral control. But the intimacy was already unfolding in quieter ways, in shared glances, in the way my thoughts bent toward him even when he wasn't present. At home, Mark and I drifted further apart. Our conversations shortened. Our silences lengthened. He tried, I could see that now, but I was no longer fully there to meet him. The guilt settled into me like a low ache, constant and familiar. One evening, Mark reached for my hand while we watched television, his fingers interlacing with mine. The gesture should have comforted me. Instead, it startled me, as if he had reached into a space I had quietly reassigned. I hated myself for that reaction. Ethan never pressured me. In fact, he created space whenever he sensed my hesitation. That restraint only deepened my attachment. I realized how dangerous it was to feel understood without being challenged. Love, I was learning too late, didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it entered gently and rearranged everything. The moment of truth came unexpectedly. Ethan asked me, softly, what I wanted, not from him, but from myself. The question lodged in my chest. I didn't answer right away. Because any honest response would demand action, and I was still hiding inside delay. That night, Mark finally asked the question I had been avoiding. He didn't accuse. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Are you still choosing me?" The simplicity of it stripped away every excuse I had rehearsed that I couldn't lie. Not convincingly. Silence answered for me. Mark nodded slowly, as if he had been preparing for that moment longer than I knew. He didn't demand explanations. He asked for honesty. And for the first time, I understood that emotional distance could wound as deeply as any physical betrayal. Later, alone, I stared at my phone, Ethan's name glowing on the screen. I realized that I was standing at a threshold. Continuing meant accepting the damage I had already caused. Ending things meant facing the emptiness I had been running from. I typed a message, then erased it. Outside, the city hummed with indifferent life. Inside, I felt the weight of choice settle fully onto my shoulders. For the first time, I understood that love was no longer the question, courage was. I ended things with Mark on a quiet morning, the kind that feels suspended between night and day. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting to justify the pain. Just two people sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around cooling mugs, speaking with a careful honesty we should have used long before. I told him the truth, not the edited version I had been offering myself, but the one that stripped away comfort. I told him I had grown distant. That I had formed an emotional bond with someone else. That I hadn't crossed certain lines, but I had still stepped away from him when he needed me present. Mark listened without interrupting. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, though his eyes weren't. He said the hardest part wasn't losing me to someone else, it was realizing I had been leaving long before I admitted it. That quiet observation landed heavier than anger ever could. That we agreed to end things with dignity. Love, Mark said, should not require someone to feel half-chosen. I knew he was right. Watching him pack a bag later that day felt unreal, as if I were observing my own life from a distance. When the door closed behind him, the apartment felt unfamiliar, hollowed out by absence. For days afterward, I moved through my routines mechanically. The silence I once resented now pressed against me from every corner. I resisted the urge to reach for Ethan immediately. I needed to know whether I was moving toward him, or merely away from my guilt. When I finally met Ethan again, it wasn't with relief. It was with vulnerability. I told him everything, the ending, the responsibility, the regret that would take time to settle. I didn't ask him for anything. I simply stood there, open in a way I had avoided for years. Ethan didn't celebrate the outcome. He didn't rush forward to fill the space Mark had left. Instead, he acknowledged the loss with respect. He said he wanted me to choose him only if I was choosing myself first. That restraint confirmed what I already sensed: this wasn't about escape. It was about alignment. That we took things slowly. Pain has a way of sharpening clarity, and I didn't want to dull it with haste. In the quiet that followed, I reflected on how easily I had mistaken stability for fulfillment, how fear had kept me silent, and how silence had cost me honesty. That I reached out to Mark once more, not to reopen wounds, but to offer accountability without expectation. He thanked me, and that was enough. Closure, I learned, doesn't always come with reconciliation. Sometimes it comes with understanding. With Ethan, the connection deepened, not through intensity, but through consistency. We talked openly about boundaries, about the cost of dishonesty, about the importance of speaking before distance becomes betrayal. I found myself present again, not because I was trying to be better, but because I finally understood what being present required. One evening, as we walked through the city, Ethan asked me if I regretted the way things began. I thought carefully before answering. I said I regretted the hurt I caused, the time I wasted pretending I was fine. But I didn't regret learning what my heart had been asking for all along. Transformation, I realized, doesn't come from perfect choices. It comes from honest ones. As the city lights reflected in the wet pavement, I felt something settle inside me, not certainty, but peace. For the first time, I wasn't living two emotional lives. I wasn't hiding from my reflection or rehearsing explanations. I was simply moving forward, aware of the weight of my decisions and willing to carry them. That unexpected meeting hadn't saved me. It had revealed me, and in that revelation, my heart, bruised, wiser, and finally awake, began again. Time did not heal me quickly, but it steadied me. Weeks passed, then months, marked not by milestones but by small proofs of change. I learned how silence could be restful instead of accusatory. I learned how to sit with regret without letting it define me. Most of all, I learned that honesty, once practiced, demanded to be lived daily. Ethan and I did not rush into labels. We moved forward with deliberate care, as if both of us understood how fragile beginnings could be when built on the ruins of something else. Our conversations were slower now, more intentional. We spoke about expectations before they hardened into assumptions. We named discomfort early, before it could metastasize into distance. There were moments when Mark resurfaced in my thoughts unexpectedly. A song he loved. A habit we shared. The memory no longer carried sharp guilt, but it did carry responsibility. I had loved him once, sincerely, and that truth deserved respect rather than erasure. Growth, I realized, did not require rewriting the past, only learning from it. One evening, Ethan and I sat across from each other at the same cafe where everything had begun. The irony was not lost on either of us. The space felt different now, stripped of secrecy. We spoke about how easily people confuse connection with permission, How desire can outpace integrity if left unchecked. Ethan asked me whether I trusted myself now. The question lingered longer than I expected. Trust, I realized, was not something regained all at once. It was rebuilt through alignment, when actions and values stopped contradicting each other. I told him I was learning to trust the version of myself who spoke sooner, who chose discomfort over concealment. That he smiled at that, not triumphantly, but with quiet affirmation. As our relationship settled into something real, it remained imperfect. We disagreed. We misread each other. But we returned to conversation each time, guided by the shared understanding that avoidance was no longer an option. Love, when honest, was not dramatic. It was disciplined. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about how easily my life could have continued unchanged. How close I came to mistaking endurance for devotion. The unexpected meeting had not been a miracle. It had been a mirror, one that forced me to confront the cost of my silence. That I no longer believed that love alone was enough. Love required courage. It required the willingness to risk being known before being comfortable. It required choosing truth even when it disrupted the life you had carefully assembled. On a quiet walk home, Ethan reached for my hand, not as a promise, not as a claim, but as an invitation. I took it with intention, aware of what it symbolized. Not rescue. Not replacement. But presence. The city moved around us, indifferent and alive. I felt grounded in a way I never had before, not because everything was certain, but because I was no longer divided. I carried my mistakes openly now, not as burdens, but as markers of growth. That unexpected meeting did not give me a new heart. It taught me how to listen to the one I already had, and as I continued forward, imperfect, accountable, awake, I understood that transformation was not a single moment. It was a practice.